All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Always, we say 10:15, but it's more like 10:18, 10:19 until we get started if you're here with us. So you have time to get your coffee if you'd like over at the parish hall. It's good to be with you all. We continue today our series on the Gospel of Matthew. I believe Father George went over the Sermon on the Mount last week. Today, this is a kind of a catch-all class. Healing, signs, and sayings, we're just basically all the middle stuff in the Gospel of Matthew. We obviously can't go through it all, but we're going to talk about what these things tell us about the whole story by looking at just a few stories together today. We have some selections from the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll walk through those. And next week, we'll go through the biggest bulk of most of the Gospels, which is Jesus' trial, death, and resurrection, just in time for Lent. As we step into that story, we'll talk about sort of how the Gospel of Matthew treats that final days of Jesus' life. But this middle section also tells us a lot about Jesus' life and ministry, and we're actually going to touch upon a section here of the temptation of Jesus in the middle here that also is in preparation for Lent, so thinking through what that means for our understanding of the Gospel of Matthew. So, as usual, why don't we start with a prayer? So let us pray. Lord God, we give you thanks for your presence among us. We give you thanks for your presence among us in silence and song, in noise and quiet. Help us as we meditate on the Gospel of Matthew to see and hear what you have to teach us today about what it means to follow you, what it means to follow after this way of life and truth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. The Gospel of Matthew. Now, if you recall, if you were with me a couple weeks ago, I did a little bit of an overview on the Gospel of Matthew. Let me just repeat a couple of the highlights so that we situate ourselves in the Gospel of Matthew here. And this is something about all the Gospels that I always like to bring up when we talk about the stories about Jesus. There's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is one of my favorite phrases, and I forget where I got it, but they're both memories and theologies, both histories and proclamations. Both memories and theologies, histories and proclamations. What does that mean? They tell us some data about who Jesus is, these stories that were passed down through the communities that wrote them down, but they're also editorializing as they're passing the stories down. They're trying to say something about what Jesus means. So it's data, but it's also making a point. What does this message mean for us today? And because of that, each of the Gospels has its own kind of distinct flavor. It's telling the story about Jesus, and it's also telling the story about the community that remembered Jesus. It's a 2-story drama, is the phrase, and that's from J. Lewis Martin, a theologian, scholar. But that 2-story drama tells us something about Jesus, what's happening down here, and something about the people who collected the stories and formed the Gospels themselves. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all each have their own flavor because in an oral society, these stories were passed down, and this is what it means to this particular group, the people around the Gospel of Matthew, the people around the Gospel of Mark, Luke, and then there's John. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have all these things in common. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because they kind of correlate to one another. And John is all the way out here being kind of weird. Just has these stories that you don't find in the other Gospels. You're like, where did that come from? That's just John. You know, he's the black sheep of the fold. You know, you just have to expect that with him. So with the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you just get these stories that recur again and again. And that's why we have the lectionary cycle kind of based around those 3. So year A, year B, year C, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John just shows up whenever he shows up, you know. We throw him into the lectionary a lot in Holy Week, and actually leading up to Easter, a lot of the stories from John show up there. And every once in a while, John will come in and come up with his sort of new agey kind of the spirit, was present with them. It has a lot of that flavor. If you've never had the chance to do this is what I recommend every time we do a class on the Gospel of Matthew. Try to sit down and read one Gospel at a time. Just sit down and read it. They're not that long, The Gospel of Matthew is, I believe, 28 chapters. It's lengthy, but it's something that you can read in an afternoon. Take a break, But don't try to, get in the weeds of what happened here and how does it fit into that context. Just get a sense of the whole narrative and see how that sits with you. And then, give it a couple of weeks and try to sit with the next Gospel and just see how that sits with you. And you'll start noticing the differences, the feelings, and the valence of each one of the Gospels. But today we're talking about Matthew. So I could go on about that. So let me just recap a little bit. I told you that Matthew is sort of structured as Jesus, the new Moses. It's almost in some ways one of the most Jewish of Gospels. It has all these references to the Old Testament, which all the Gospels have, but this one tries to make a point of it almost. And at the same time, it's got some of the most virulent language against the Pharisees. So it's anti-Jewish at the same time, and that's something we have to reckon with. But what's really happening there is that the Pharisees were the other competing group in the same sort of setting. Jesus was a rabbi, the Pharisees were rabbis too, and they're kind of occupying the same fold. The conversations within the same family are often the most strident and difficult to have. Think about some conversations that happen within political parties around people that largely agree but kind of don't see eye to eye about the minutiae. That's what you're seeing happen with the Pharisees and Jesus. And so you have Jesus saying, "You brood of vipers," to the people that are probably appealing to the same crowd, because Jesus is a Jewish rabbi too. They're kind of in the same territory. And you have some of that competition playing out in there. But you still have that vision in the Gospel of Matthew of Jesus as the new Moses, Jesus as a teacher of the law who has come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. You hear this phrase again and again in the Gospel of Matthew. And that's why we have, we sort of say that Matthew is one of the most Jewish of the Gospels. It kind of appeals to that. So I have an example for you about that. I didn't bring this one up last week, but this is just to give you a taste. It's the two columns at the top of the handout. There's a section in Mark and Matthew, I believe it may be in Luke, where it's the woes. These are visions of the end times that Jesus kind of throws in there. And in between these woes, you get this small vision. The context of the passage isn't as important, but I just want to point this out to you. So in Mark 13, it says, "Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter." Winter is coming, people. This is where that came from. I'm editorializing here. That's not actually where that came from. Matthew 24, same phrase. Again, you see the overlap. They're borrowing from the same source. "Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath." Do you see that? It's almost as if Matthew is concerned about sort of the things that mark this as a sort of Jewish identity. And you kind of find these references embedded in the Gospel of Matthew as pointers to the kind of community that he was talking with them. So that's just one example that gives you a glimpse of, okay, he's referring to the rituals and the laws in a way that the other Gospels don't touch upon sometimes. It just emphasizes that in a different way. So something to keep in mind as we navigate this gospel. Okay, that's enough recap for now. As we went through last time that I was here, a couple weeks back, we talked about the beginning of Jesus' ministry with his baptism, and we talked about the element of that baptismal scene in the Gospel of Matthew that doesn't show up as prominently in the other Gospels, that Jesus says, "It is important for me to do this to fulfill all righteousness." To fulfill all righteousness is to fulfill all the commandments of the law. Again, it's kind of emphasizing, I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. I have come to sort of be the fulfillment of the law, not to get rid of it. We have this easy dichotomy that we sometimes make between the law and the gospel. That's useful in certain ways, but not very useful when we read scripture after a while, because the way I like to put it, you don't always like the New Testament God. The New Testament God can also be harsh. And you see a lot of mercy in the Old Testament. That's part of the message within the law. So this dichotomy that we make of Old Testament God, New Testament God, doesn't actually work that well. It's a helpful dichotomy for us to understand sort of the giving of law, message of grace, but both are elements within all of Scripture. So that's just something important to keep in mind, and I think Matthew kind of helps us delve into that. So we went over Jesus' baptism, and we're getting into the beginning of his ministry here. I still wanted to go over the temptation scene, because I think it's instructive for how we understand Jesus' healings and his miracles, everything that he says thereafter, the parables, everything. So let me read it to you. It's that first section from Matthew 4, 1 through 11. And then I'm going to ask you to pair up with 2 or 3 people around you to discuss what stands out, things that caught your attention, questions that it brings up for you. So as you have it in front of you, feel free to follow along and just be thinking, what catches my attention here? There's no right answer. It's just whatever stands out to you. And we'll discuss for a little bit and we'll come back together. So here it is, Matthew chapter 4, verse 1 through 11. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him into a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. The word of the Lord. All right. What stands out? Any phrases, images? What questions does this bring up for you? Discuss with a couple people next to you, preferably someone you might not have met yet. Just say hi, introduce yourself. And then we'll come back together in 6 to 7 minutes, I'll say.
Hey, you haven't met Mike. Gary. Well, I have something. The first sentence for me is that we're led by the Spirit to be tempted by the devil. To me, that stands out. I feel like the Spirit told me this to all the good, all the good, and even trust. It just makes sense of this whole purpose. Being influenced by that is important to his ministry and outreach. Us into temptation, right? And that's hard. Flesh, desire, whatever. So that's what strikes. They're really good at that way. Yeah. Right. It was one of his prayer times. Yeah. Right. Right. But now right. Just to be as human as possible, right? To just show that community, just show, put him through that, so that he understood. Yeah, he understood it.
Well, that's something new from them.
Strong too, so it's a message for us that. Right. Lead us through.
I remember this.
Yeah.
All right, maybe take 30 seconds to wrap that thought up if you have one.
There's a lot of what you got. Food, power.
Right.
Over wherever you want.
In the most extreme circumstances.
Right. Yeah.
All right, let's come back together. Thoughts, questions, comments? Anyone want to share something with a larger group?
What was the Jewish definition of fast?
What was the Jewish definition of fasting? Interesting. Yeah, I'll get to that. I don't know if I have a definition proper, but I'll talk about fasting a little bit. I think here in this passage you can assume is that he did not eat. That's how the story is written.
Well, I don't think he could have not, he may have been able to not eat for 40 days, but he wouldn't have been able to survive without water.
That's right. These stories from Scripture. Yeah.
So the other thing, because I grew up, and it just hit me when you were reading this right the other day. I grew up in a Baptist church where, everything is literal. But when you were talking about with the scripture, the devil came and he tempted him those 3 times, I don't think that he literally took him to the temple, or he took them somewhere else, or he took them to the top of the mountain. I think it was all a mind game.
I'll talk a little bit about that. I think you're bringing up these questions we have with Scripture sometimes when we come to it, and it's like, did this really happen this way? There's evidences of the miraculous here. How did it take place? There's one way of thinking of it, like taking it literally, this actually happening. There's also, well, it couldn't have happened because in this setting, we have the advances of science that tell us certain things. When I approach Scripture, I'd like, maybe this is my invitation to you. Sometimes we approach it trying to make sense of it all, trying to make sense of all the pieces of the story in accordance with our modern way of seeing things, in accordance with the way we view the world. And I would invite us into that space of wonder. Well, this is how they told the story. And there is an element here that requires a kind of suspension of disbelief in order to step into the story. What are they trying to say about who Jesus is through this story? I think sometimes we want to insert our modern worldview into a text that wasn't written with that modern worldview in mind. And it's maybe our invitation into a different way of thinking and seeing the world, a world filled with a certain kind of frame that invites us into. So sometimes people ask me, did this really happen this way? And I have to tell you, I don't know. I wasn't there. I just wasn't. And I think anybody who tells you that they know how it happened is probably lying because they also weren't there. Can we sit with that? Can we sit with a space of wonder here about what it's trying to tell us, what it might tell us about what it means to be God's people, what it might tell us about God's action in the world? So that's just an invitation there. But with a lot of these things, I'll always say, I don't know. Okay, any other comments, questions?
That seems like two rabbis debating scripture with each other.
Oh, that's interesting, Peter.
Because you have the devil saying, well, turn these stones to be bread, right? He's quoting scripture here, and then Jesus will come back with a response.
Yeah, Peter. So for those who couldn't hear him, two rabbis debating scripture. That's what it feels like, this setting, right? Think about it in the context of the Gospel of Matthew. I hadn't thought of that. Just the conversation happening. They're arguing over the text of the law. It's a debate here. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Going once? Yeah.
Just to build on that, I think what my daughter noticed was that the temptation of Christ came through a contorted use of the word of God. There wasn't something out there, something in here.
A contorted use of the word of God. That's the temptation. I love that. That's a good point. Just the way that you can take scripture. This is another aspect of when you take scripture really literally, you can really get scripture to say whatever you want. I mean, proof texting, you can find a passage that supports your point of view. You can find passages in scripture that support the opposing point of view too. You just have to figure out how to fluctuate it. It's hard to get a text that was written over 1,500 years by multiple authors to cohere with itself. Sometimes it's at odds with itself. And the work of us sort of considering this sacred writ is not to figure out the exact thing that it's supposed to say about XYZ issue. It's to invite us into this is all our sacred text. What does it have to say about how we view the world? But the contorted use of it, that's present in our lives too. People use scripture to argue whatever they want. And it's powerful. All right. Anything else before I say a few words about this passage? Okay. Well, you lost my place right when I want to start talking about it. This is the temptation of Jesus, 40 days and 40 nights, fasting, all these elements of it. This is hearkening back to so many stories in the Old Testament, right? 40 days in the ark, 40 days and 40 nights in the ark as the word was flooded. Noah and his family were there. Moses fasts and receives the law on Mount Sinai for 40 days. Same thing. He's up on a mountain. The Israelites wander through the wilderness for 40 years. Elijah walks to Mount Horeb for 40 days and 40 nights on the strength of a cake and jar of water. Again, that fasting concept, it's kind of imbued. These are all moments of trial that are supposed to bring that person into a space of encounter, theophany, seeing God in the flesh in some way or another. And that's what we're seeing happen here with the temptation. You'll notice that at the beginning it says that Jesus was led up by the Spirit. So it wasn't that he was led there by the devil. He was led up by the Spirit. This was set up by God in the imagination of this text, right? This time of trial is supposed to be instructive in some way. And he is not being punished. He is not lost. He was led there by the Spirit. So it's almost like a trial time assessment. His readiness for the status as God's beloved Son after the baptism takes place. So we see that take place here. Devil, the word devil, it's the Greek diabolos, Hebrew satan. It's the accuser. That's what it means, the word, the accuser. And you see that playing out here as two debating rabbis, whatever it is, it's someone accusing him of you're not understanding this right. What happens here in Jesus' responses, at least in Jesus' responses, all of them are from Deuteronomy, the book of the law in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy literally means deuteronomos in Greek, second law. It's the second giving of the law, the repetition of the law. So Jesus is pointing back to the law as he's responding to the devil, right? I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? There's something about the spirit of the law that is important here. And that's what Jesus is about. If you listen to Reverend Kathy's sermon this morning, you kind of hear some of that, right? That the law has something to say, the spirit of it has something to tell us about the God whom we serve. Now, the temptations themselves, we walk through the three of them. One way to understand them is that they point to three different aspects of Jesus' identity as the Son of God. And the temptations point to different ways of thinking about how he navigates the world around him. The first is food. Do you amass more than your share by turning stones into bread? Or do you pray for our daily bread? Right? Think of this, the Lord's Prayer. Right? Not amassing everything for myself so that I have more, and I can always turn to that. I just need my daily bread. The temptation here is to gluttony, to having more than you need, greed. Do you amass food for yourself, or do you amass food to distribute to all? Think of the miracles of feeding the thousands, right? Just a little bit of bread to feed all those thousands of people. It's a different way of thinking about food, about what it means to amass wealth, even. Secondly, the second temptation is about power. You can ask God to do anything. You're powerful enough. Why don't you prove it to me? In his response, Jesus models a different kind of power, not using his relationship with God to forego suffering, but enduring a humiliating death to turn the world's notion of power upside down. Jesus doesn't use power just for his own means. Power is meant to be used for something else. The third temptation, bow down and you'll have authority over all this place. It's the temptation of leadership. Do you want the kingdom of the world or the kingdom of heaven, where the last ones are first and the first shall be last, right? To be a leader doesn't mean the same thing. The kingdom of heaven is the kingdom upside down. The kingdom of heaven is where the last ones get first dibs on blessing. That's my favorite quote from Chance the Rapper. I just wanted to make that for you all. The last ones get first dibs on blessing. It's just a really good line. But again, that's what's happening here. He's turning the definition of leadership upside down. Are you tempted by this? Or are you going to model something different? So food, power, leadership. Jesus is modeling a different way of navigating the world. And in doing so, he demonstrates that God is with us. The God who is always with us, even to the end of the age, Matthew says. The God who has gone ahead for us into these moments of trial and temptation, to the most forsaken corners of the world, and tested that and said, there's a different way to be here. There's a different way I am inviting you into, and I am participating in that life with you. That's the miracle of incarnation. God with us, even in those times of trial. That's what's being modeled here. And that's what we see crop up in what we see in the miracles, the sayings, everything that happens before his, leading up to his death and resurrection. We see Jesus modeling a different way of navigating the world. So that's the invitation here. Now, one more thing about the temptations before I move on with the last 10 minutes. Oh boy. We'll see what we can cover. One last thing here is that these things are not bad in and of themselves, right? Food, power, leadership, they're not bad. They're not bad things. It's good to have food. You need it to survive. It's pretty impossible to, survive without food and water. Power is not bad in and of itself. Power is just the ability to affect a change in some way or another. That can be used for good, and that can be used for evil. Power is not a bad word. We've seen it used poorly. We sometimes associate it with bad things. But power is not bad in and of itself. Leadership, we've seen leadership perform very poorly, but it's not bad in and of itself. It's something that we're all called into. Again, but Jesus is modeling a different way of dealing with each of these things. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to skip through the calling of the disciples, but I just want to point out a couple of things about this passage without reading it. Right after this passage, almost immediately after this passage, we get Jesus stepping out into the beginning of his ministry and immediately calling the first disciples, Andrew and Simon Peter and James and John, the four fishermen who drop their nets and immediately follow after him. Just two things about this passage before I move on. At the beginning, you get the setting. Jesus comes back from the temptation, and he walks to Galilee, leaves Nazareth, and makes his home in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. And then there's a quote from the prophet Isaiah. Setting is important. Location is important. There's something important being named here that we don't always catch. These are all land holdings that are now being held by Roman rule. Jesus is traveling through occupied territory, and it's sort of being named. There is a different ruler in town, and Jesus is trying to model a different kind of rule. So pay attention to locations. It's trying to say something. These are contested lands. And Jesus is traveling through and saying, will you follow me? At the end of it, the passage, let me just read a section from verse 24 onward. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, people possessed by demons or having epilepsy, or afflicted with paralysis, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. This movement is building here. And you can see, because of the references to the region, because of the references to his relationship with the world around him, you see a man who's proclaiming, blessed are the poor, and providing healing for them, people who have been left out of society at the margins. And he's providing healing, but it's not just healings for healing's sake. He's pointing to a different way of being in the world. And he's saying the Roman rulers, ancient Near Eastern emperors often talked about themselves as demigods, people who provided for the people. It was because of them that food was on the table, that they had everything they need. It's not really all that different from rulers now. We just don't use that religious language maybe as much. But again, we have that sense of being a provider, and Jesus is here and actually providing and sort of healing the hurt and pain that a cruel economy has on the people that are present among him. That's what Jesus is about. So let's skip ahead and just kind of go through Matthew 8, verse 1 through 13. Say a few words about that. These are a couple of miracles back to back that I wanted to highlight, and we'll leave the last passage for next time as we enter into Jesus' death, crucifixion, and resurrection. So let me read you Matthew 8, verse 1 through 13. When Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and there was a man with a skin disease who came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. He stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be made clean. Immediately his skin disease was cleansed. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress." And he said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard him, he was amazed and said to those who followed him, "Truly, I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and will take their places at the banquet with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done for you according to your faith." And the servant was healed in that hour. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, these miracles, in just a few minutes here, they're sort of back to back in chapter 8, what's preceded it. If you think about the context of the gospel, we went over the temptation, the beginning of Jesus' ministries, the calling of the first disciples, and then we get right into the first great discourse of the Gospel of Matthew. There's 5 of them. The first one is where we get the Sermon on the Mount. So if you think about last class, we covered the 3 chapters in between. That is just one long discourse. We read through the discourse, and then we get into this healing story. So you've seen Jesus proclaim his vision of the world being right? The Blessed Ours and the Lord's Prayer. And then we dive immediately into these 2 healing stories. So first of all, the first story, Jesus cleanses the leper. Right before it, Jesus descends from the mountain after giving his great discourse, again appealing to the image of Moses receiving divine commandments. He's descending from the mountains to do the work of God. Where Moses received divine commandments, Jesus interprets them. And that's what his work is about. He's interpreting the law. And he comes into contact with this leper. Leprosy here is probably not Hansen's disease. That's leprosy in our modern terms is probably any of many sort of skin afflictions that were present throughout that day and time. It could be a variety of things. But the problem isn't just that it's leprosy, it's that this kind of skin disease ostracized this person, isolated them. They couldn't participate ritually or socially. They were kind of outside in the margins of society. And the restoration that Jesus plays here is not just physical. This is a restoration into community, a restoration into life, and a belonging into a larger body. And what Jesus is doing is social reintegration. It's not just healing. It's allowing this person to belong to a larger body. And at the end, you hear this moment where he says, "Tell no one nothing." We'll get to that later. This is what Jesus always says in the gospel. Tell no one nothing. It's the messianic secret. Don't tell no one that I am who I am, right? But he says, "Go present yourself to the priest." How does he do that? You need the priest approvals to be reintegrated into society ritually, right? The priest has to sort of say go. Jesus is sort of showing his authority even over the religious authorities of the day. And he is doing the healing of social reintegration, of wrapping people back into belonging into a society. He's building the kingdom. So then we go from priestly authority to the second story, where we meet a Roman centurion. Think about how convenient. We talked about priestly authority. Let's talk about worldly authority now. A Roman centurion was someone who was in charge of up to 100 soldiers. Someone who had power at that time. Someone who, again, they were living under occupied territory. They were part of the Roman Empire now. So this person represents probably a hated figure in some way or another, right? They're the occupiers. And the centurion comes in and submits himself to Jesus' authority. And again, we get this humanizing element from Jesus reaching out beyond the margins, not just to people who were left out and outcasts, but people that were hated and had power over people. Think about, if you heard Reverend Kathy's sermon again this morning, again, it wasn't just to the people we think of in the margins. Jesus is always pointing us to the people at the margin and saying, no, like, I know you think that's the farthest you can go, but if you really want to imagine what it means to love like I do, I want you to imagine the worst person possible and then think about the one that comes after that. That's what Jesus is doing here. That's what Jesus is always about. And he's showing, in some ways, that even though the centurion has a lot of power, he doesn't have power like Jesus does. He can bring people together, he can heal, and he can create a community where there once was none, among even the worst of enemies. That's what these dual healings are kind of doing here. So that's if you think about Jesus' miracles, sayings, and healings, just think about the fact that they're always pointing toward the vision of the kind of community that the kingdom of heaven is supposed to be like. It's not just healings for the healing's sake. It's not just signs for people to accept him as some wonder worker. He's pointing the way toward a vision of what restored community looks like. And nothing in the Gospels makes that point more strikingly, more succinctly than Jesus' death, crucifixion, and resurrection, which is what we'll discuss next time. So, go in peace.